It is now time for the panel discussion, which will be facilitated by Assistant Professor Wilson Goh, the head of Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine, Good Research Practice Office. We would like to invite Dr. Lenny Tettelman, Ms. Ko Ming Shi, Assistant Prof. Owen Schaefer, and Prof. Nico Wenderoff to join the facilitator on stage. The floor is yours, Prof. Goh.
Okay, just find your faces and sit down. Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for having stayed up to this point. I think we have had a really very enlightening series of talks. You know, I myself, I would say I have learned a lot right in these last few hours as well. And I hope that, you know, this time that you have spent with us has also been very meaningful and also very well spent. Now, I have actually a series of questions for all the speakers, all right? But before we go into that, right, I also noticed that there are quite a few questions that have come from the floor as well. So because, right, you guys are so important, so we'll start with yours first, all right? Okay, so I will probably start with the first question to Owen, all right? Because there's quite a lot of questions pertaining around diamond access journals, all right? So I'm just going to lump both questions together. And one of the questions go like this, basically. You know, do you have any comments, Owen, or with regards to ethics on researchers supporting free diamond or platinum OA journals, or is it merely suggested to be a hindrance towards adoption of open access? For example, would it be equivalent to say, right, that supporting free open access journals is not always ethical? Does it make sense?
Yeah, so just to be clear, I'm actually of the perspective that if all journals became diamond, that would be the ethical ideal. Because diamond, you know, diamond solves the cost issue at both ends, right? Because there is no fee to publish, there's no fee to access, right? And that way there's no party that bears the cost, aside from the entity funding the journal, who presumably there might be a charitable enterprise. Some libraries do this, some publishers do this. Yeah, so I guess I'm not immediately thinking of ethical downsides aside from ensuring funding. I do think, though, that given there are a few diamond access journals, they're not always because they're often new. You know, new journals are often difficult to build up reputations. They're not as well read. They're not always because they're not affiliated with a major publisher. They might not have that kind of backing in terms of, you know, spreading the word about new articles. So I do think there's sort of an ethical obligation for us to look out for these diamond and platinum journals in our field. So I work in biomedical ethics. One of them is the Journal of Practical Ethics, which is funded partly via charitable funding. And you know, and they have you know, articles that don't necessarily get a lot of play in terms of you know, publishers that promote them. But so researchers having a proactive obligation to seek these out, to learn from these, and you know, that increases the likelihood that we end up citing them. That creates incentives to fund more of these types of journals. But yeah, so I guess that's the ethical ideal, but I recognize it's also the most difficult because it requires direct subsidy. And you know, if you try to do this at scale, it would be quite expensive to make all journals platinum. So it's not clear that it's a scalable model.
Thank you for that, Owen. The question can also be answered by any of you as well if you have any further comments to that. No? All right. Okay, then we'll go to the next one. All right. And this one, right, is a question directed to Ming Shi, actually. All right. So it goes as follows. If a DAC is required to review requests to trust, would this be considered fully open data sharing?
Back to many of the things which we have been talking about. I think at the end of the day, it's really about the balance that we're trying to find. It's definitely not an easy one. Between fully open and I guess secured open, what that should look like. I guess what we're trying to endeavor here is to say that at the end of the day, while we encourage the use and the sharing of the data, we are still at the end of the day accountable for the data. And to engender trust, and I use the word trust in a very specific way in this case, because at the end of the day, the only way to promote greater use and acceptance is to show the value of what such data sharing can bring, but also to demonstrate to the public that we are looking at this kind of sharing in a very serious manner. And I think having a party that provides the objective review does give a sense, provide that ability to do so. And of course, having the other types of access controls in place are as part of that whole 5-stage framework that we really hope to promote and get the public to understand how we look at data sharing in a very, very robust manner.
Thank you for that, Ming Shi. In fact, there is a very interesting question about what should we do when things get really horribly wrong. But before we follow up with that, let's go back to Lenny. All right. So Lenny, there is a question for you as well, and this has to do, right, with the method sharing, because you are, after all, the CEO of Protocols.io. So someone actually asked, in your survey, you showed that people are actually quite afraid of others finding fault with their methods. So how do you think this can be dealt with?
So the question is about fault, and we have seen this at Protocols.io very clearly, that we've been trying to welcome negative results and they just don't come in, and provisional things. And a lot of it is really because scientists are worried of misleading and sharing something, and their reputations are on the line. But for the public sharing, when you publish a protocol on Protocols.io, we actually ask you to self-certify whether it's a protocol that works in your hands, whether it's in development or other. And we always display it under the title, what you yourself think, right? So whether or not something is peer-reviewed, unless it's being reproduced in a lab somewhere else, it's a process that takes time. And yes, people are cautious around it, but we give you the tool to self-label at least, right? And then over time, trust builds up in protocols. And I think, the same concerns, it's not just about method sharing, the same concerns apply to data, and the same concerns apply to publishing a research paper, period, right? You're making a claim, you think you've done your best, and even with peer review, but only time will tell. And that's always a risk that we run, but the society does give us funding with the expectation that we share the research outputs. The funders give us that, right? And so you're sort of, as an academic, you're signing up for that risk.
Yes. Yes.
Can I steal yours? So I just wanted to add something to the protocols. I love the initiative because I found it so impressive when you showed that 0% of the methods were completely reported, and I think that's a real problem. And I think you are mitigating that with your approach. I just want to add another thing. So many of you might be aware that there are actually reporting guidelines out right now, right? And many of them in many fields. So for those of you that write their methods, please check whether there are reporting guidelines. It's like a checklist where you can just see I've really touched on everything. Because I absolutely agree, it is so essential that you really provide all the information necessary for replication. I think it really starts there.
No, not at all, Nikki. Yes, I believe being as correct as possible is also, I think, important guideline to follow as well, right? We shouldn't just post out things irresponsibly. If you can justify how and under what circumstances it works, right? I think you got yourself pretty well as well. Okay, good. So let's start with the contentious question, shall we? Okay, so this I think it's also extending from Nicole's talk, but I think it hits all of us as well. So to all the speakers, what should or could we do when the genie is out of the bottle, right? So in other words, when the data is released and we have not exercised sufficient due diligence, and something happens, right? Okay, then what should we do? I think there's a second part to this question, but I think let's just focus on this one, shall we? All right. Does anybody want to go first?
Ray. So, I mean, it's very clear. So once the genie is out of the bottle, it's very hard to get it back in. So there are some general considerations about that. And that is probably also something that concerns trust. So people that are saying, we are accountable for keeping your data safe, and we don't do that. The question is, do we have to do some personal compensation? What are the consequences also, not only for us as people who have just ruined their reputation, but also for those that have probably experienced some harm due to our negligence, so to speak. And this is as far as I know, an unresolved question. I don't know how trust deals with that, but I mean, of course, you have access control. So, so this is a question that is still discussed, how as a community we should deal with that.
Misha, do you want to take this as well? Does trust have a compensation plan?
So actually, when we were talking to all the different institutions to set up the agreements, right, with trust, this is really at your presidents and your CE level. I think at least within the public sector research organizations, I think we realized that we can take the extreme approach where we decide, legally we're going to start putting in all the liability caps and all that, or do we agree that collectively as a health system, as a research system, ecosystem, we are collectively now responsible? Because trust, as you can imagine, is a whole data lifecycle. The contributors have the responsibility in ensuring that you only contribute anonymized data. You should not be giving us any identifiables. The trust is, of course, responsible for ensuring secure use of the platform, and the users, again, are responsible for ensuring you don't try to re-identify an individual. And I guess the responsibility really lies across the whole spectrum of users to uphold this and get this in place. But back to that question of ultimately, if something should go wrong, and that's where I guess the controls are in place to do so. The data are really been anonymized and tokenized, and that we do not even allow for download of the data per se. So I think these are, I guess, what we try to put in place to strike a good balance, to enable us to still push ahead with data innovation, but ensuring and making sure we can all still sleep soundly at night, that we have, what we think are reasonable controls.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different things that could go wrong. So I guess it depends what we're talking about in terms of what's gone wrong. But I mean, so with formal data breaches, there are legal requirements for notification under the Personal Data Protection Act, and those are well established. But where there's a gray zone are things that aren't actually data breaches, but are for something else. And I think when you look at the principles of good governance, these include principles of transparency and accountability, right? So going beyond the legal mandates of notification for breaches, there'd be a good case for when data is released and used outside the purpose for which it was released. A notification of users would be in line with the general principles of transparency, even if there isn't a legal obligation because it falls outside of the strict data breach requirements of, say, PDPA. And yeah, so similarly on the accountability side, if you have a sort of policy that data was released and then it was realized that it was being used in a way that intenders didn't intend, what are the actual consequences for those individuals? Are there individuals at the organization that could be held responsible for that? And when you have public scandals of this sort, there is often a request for individuals to be held accountable in that regard. And having a system in place where it can be, if that does come up, who the individual is responsible, can be a way of ensuring trust in the instance that there is an unintended outcome. Corporate responsibility is an approach that can help ensure everyone has a stake in this, but there's a risk there that when there is, misuse that it looks like nobody is held to account because responsibility is diffused across the whole system. And this sometimes happens with data breaches. Well, who is the individual that is going to be held responsible? And sometimes the public does demand that there be identifiable individuals that suffer those consequences. But on other times, at the same time, sometimes it just is the case that the responsibility falls on multiple parties. Sometimes it is the case that it's a whole system failure, and that needs to be acknowledged as well. Yeah, so but transparency and accountability as the governance principles I would advocate here.
Anything for that? Okay. Okay, thanks for the sharing, Owen. Okay, good. So there are a few other questions that kind of loosely are related to each other. So I'm just going to tie them together. And actually, one of the questions that I wanted to tie in actually come from me myself as well. So this was actually brought up twice this morning. First from Joseph, and then subsequently by Ling San, right? So Ling San talked about both, right, the pros of open science, open research, but he also had mentioned, right, there are of course dark consequences which you all have covered as such. But besides the perks, right, there is also the issue of incentivization and time as well. And I think Lenny has done a tremendous job in trying to help people understand that, open science doesn't mean time wasting on basically having to exhaust a huge amount of time, right, invested into performing open research. But since I think many of the questions on the floor actually pertain around academia, and many of us here are also subjected to similar restrictions and KPIs, right? So how do you think, as an institution, how can we incentivize, open research better?
Not an institution. Not an institution per se as well, but what we have tried to do, I guess, again, varying from a trust perspective, it's a whole shift, a whole mindset shift, I would say, in terms of how we are getting contributors to come forward. It's not a natural thing to do for data generators to want to put forth their data. And so striking that balance and trying to understand what is in it for them is very important. We spent a lot of time talking to many of these large programs. And I would say that in general, people are not adverse to that, to wanting to share, but they want to, of course, ensure that they get the first use of the data. They get exclusive use upfront. They want to ensure that they continue to be able to use those data. And so these are things which we work into, I guess, the considerations of how we decide on the terms upfront with them. Funding agencies are very important as well, because once they put that into the grant terms, then there's also less arguments. But I think we don't want to, have to exercise that, because at the end of the day, we see data contributors as a very key pillar to get this whole thing right. They understand the data the most. If you want to really enable the sharing, it is not just sharing the data, but you need to share the knowledge of the data, the understanding of how your data is organized and how your data is structured. And without that, actually, sharing of the data is quite useless, in my opinion. So engaging them in a very meaningful way upfront, ensuring that their concerns, as I mentioned just now, are taken care of and addressed in a reasonable manner, and ensuring that even when their data are shared onwards, they do have a voice into how the data is used, how they can collaborate with those individuals, I think will go a long way in promoting that sharing.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I mean, I think, yeah, institutions, of course, have a role. We talked some about, I think, the institutional policies in place that can encourage open data use, encourage and require even posting to relevant repositories with open access. Of course, having funding for such, given we're currently in a situation where most open access publishing does require monetary support, and having institutions, set aside money for researchers to publish open access is important. Ideally, funders would have this, and some we saw, US and Europe having increased support for that. But yeah, having funders get more serious about open access and open data would also provide those incentives. When it comes to the KPIs, I'm very sensitive to that as well. I think, you know, that's where the talk earlier about the fact this can improve your citations. That's something that researchers are going to be incentivized by, because you look at, you know, tenure promotion and hiring, you know, that citation count is really important. So I think that also that evidence itself is something that researchers' ears are going to perk up on when they hear the citation count issues. Yeah.
I think Owen said already that there is a certain degree of freedom that certain institutions can request this is happening. But you were asking about the incentives. So the incentives. So you might have realized that some journals offer you to publish an accompanying paper only with data. And in a way, this is a real publication that is citable and so forth. So that might be one way to incentivize that. And certain publishers are doing that already. And that is basically for sharing data. I think how you would make it easier to implement that is to really help people to implement it. And, you know, to really help them from the institution, because there are so many open questions you have to do or to solve. So help them to get that sorted. And I personally think a very important point is promotions and other things. And we all know that a Nature paper can change your life as an academic, right? We do not know yet whether an open science paper can change your life. But that is, of course, a way how we do evaluations with our younger colleagues. And I think they're the academic institutions. They have a big handle to promote open science. And I don't know whether we still have somebody from upper leadership here, whether they would be willing to do that. I think you have to ask them.
We have someone here.
You know, it's I said in my talk that the lab that I joined in Berkeley in 2003 was the co-founder of Public Library of Science. And in order to join the lab, I had to promise that I would not publish any subscription papers, right? And this is 2003, where PLOS Biology was launching. There was no PLOS One. And I remember as a graduate student, there were many postdocs in the lab, and every single one of them got a faculty position. Many of them before they published anything from their postdoc. And you can just say, well, that's an extraordinary, that's an amazing lab. You know, it's an exception to the rule. But Professor Eisen at that point was not tenured. He was not HHMI yet. And just because he was committed to open access, that's the rule that he made for the lab. And it worked, right, for the postdocs that were coming in. And I'm not saying that there are no committees that just look at the impact factor of the journal and instead of looking at the quality of the paper. But I think sometimes when we look at superstar researchers, they publish high impact factor papers, and we think that they got their faculty positions because of the Nature paper. And sometimes that's the case, but sometimes the superstar researchers, it's a correlation, not a causation, right? That it may be that if you publish in PLOS Biology or eLife, or you don't publish at all yet, you get the position and then the work comes out in Nature, but we think that it's because of that. And, you know, there is also a cost. There's a really interesting recent discussion just over the last couple of weeks that is happening because the journal eLife has just announced that they are no longer going to be rejecting papers that have gone out for peer review, right? So eLife is completely changing the model. Starting January of next year, you submit a paper to eLife and it goes out to review, it's accepted, right? And it's up to you as the author to say when you're done with it, but they will publish the reviews openly. You can respond to them. You can then put in a new version of the paper, but eLife is doing this, and it's a major change. And there's a question, well, will people still publish on eLife? Will it count for promotion? So it goes right into the incentives. But to me, an interesting question that we don't really have data on is, we know that getting a Nature Cell paper can make your career. But do we know what the cost is of trying to get the Nature paper? How many people go through rejection after rejection after rejection, going from Nature to Cell to Science, and then dropping out of science, right? Or dropping out of academia and getting dispirited? How many people don't get a faculty position because they're chasing the Nature paper? And how do we know, you know, if you just did the work and published this in eLife and PLOS Biology, and you got 3 papers out in PLOS Biology instead of 0 papers in Nature, what impact does that have in the career? I don't have a quantitative answer to it, but I think it's a hard question, and it will be very interesting to see the eLife experiment. You know, what do the funders say? What do the institutions say?
Can I add to something very briefly? So sorry, when I made this comment, it was not to say nature is better than open access or whatever. It was more to say that right now, the fact whether faculty is publishing open access or not, it's not a criterion, right? So, and I think that if you really want to incentivize, sorry, I'm always looking at you, and I probably shouldn't, but if you really want to incentivize that, I think then also our evaluation committees have to change a little bit the criteria that they use to evaluate good scientists. Maybe our KPIs have to change a little.
That's right. Don't look at me. Look at Prof. Yes, I agree that there is a lot of things to change. Well, we have a little bit of time left, so I'm just going to throw out an open question to everyone here as well. I mean, first of all, right, I think thank you very much for all your very insightful comments and your wisdom throughout the year. I mean that you have accrued for your research and also for your interactions, you know, of course, also for thinking out, you know, these various policies and what if scenarios. Now, I also run the PhD program, you know, in this school. And one of the things that I noticed, right, is that, you know, these young scientists, right, as we train them, you know, we are essentially training them, right, to emulate after us, you know, the way we pursue science, our values, our attitudes towards science, and so on and so forth, right? I think having these incentivizations and also making it easy for people to, right, to tap into it and see the benefits of it, right? I think it's all well and good. But, you know, do you think we can do something, you know, to kind of like enshrine these values into the next generation of scientists as well? What do you think? What do you think is that one most pertinent thing that can be done in order to try to enshrine it and to, well, I wouldn't say beat it to them, but to encode it into their DNA so that, you know, they start to think about these issues as well and not just about science, nature, cell papers alone, you know, as a means to an end.
Yeah, so this area of inculcating virtue is a large area of sort of ethics and philosophical investigation. I will say the most promising model in this regard does come from virtue ethics, right? And one of the ideas of virtue ethics is about modeling, right? And you talk about having a lab, you talk about having a department, you have senior colleagues, and junior scholars will look up to them and will emulate them, you just say. So that means the onus is on the senior colleagues, senior scholars, even the mid-career scholars, to be talking about journals in the ways they talk about cell, they talk about science, they talk about +1. How are they talking about it? They're saying, yeah, positively or negatively. What are they emphasizing? You mentioned the very nice lab policy about, you know, only publishing in open access journals, right? That's the sort of thing. It's not just about the policy, but the attitude and the approach. And so yeah, so beyond, you know, I do teach, you know, ethics classes, and we try to teach standards, and that's nice. But having a cohort of mid-career and senior scholars that can really, you know, demonstrate and live out these, you know, commitments to open science, that to me is the most important thing.
I also wanted to add, you know, with preprints, with the eLife experiment, I think acknowledging what we're discussing, what I shared by email a couple of weeks ago with this group, is I keep thinking about scientists being required to do more and more to get their PhD, to get their first author paper. And there was a paper published in 2015 called Accelerating Biomedical Publishing, where the professor Ron Vale looked at how long does it take students at University of California, San Francisco to get their first author paper in their PhD program. And over the last 20 or 30 years, I don't remember the number exactly, but it's something like that has increased from 4.5 to 6 years, right? So all across the board, journals are asking for more, right? We have better tools and, you know, can do high throughput biology, but we're asked to do more. And I think keeping scientists in mind and asking what can publishers do, what can tool makers do to make your life easier so that it's not just an afterthought, so it's not a time of publication when you're asking for checklists and compliance, but really thinking like, how can we make the scientists' lives easier? I think there's a lot of opportunity, right? From simple things like making it a click of a button to send from where your data is today to the public repository, right? Instead of having to download it to your computer and upload into a national repository and fill out all the fields again. Those are small things that can reduce the barrier to open sharing without asking for dean and provost to change what the university is doing. Not that it's not important for funders and institutions to think about the incentives, but there's so much opportunity for all of us, publishers, tool makers, and researchers, right, to take steps without waiting for someone else to fix the problem.
No other comments. Yeah, I like the part about the idea, right, of starting organically and letting it gain momentum and becoming a movement. In fact, this very conference itself, right, started like this on the ground. You know, we started off as my office, and of course the research integrity office and the librarians. You know, all of us, we never interact with each other at all normally on a day-to-day basis. You know, on one fine day, the stars just align. We just say, hey, why don't we just do a conference together on open research, right? And then one thing led to another, and before that, right, then we managed to get all you guys in here together with some of our university leadership as well. So I think that's something that I really feel very strongly about as well. You know, let it grow, and then, right, hopefully it can help to change minds and corporate mindsets as well. So with that, right, let's end off the panel. So could you all join me in thanking the panelists? Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.